I watched my daughter-in-law, Sophia, raise a glass. "To everyone who makes this company run," she sneered, "except the hag who owns it and steals the profit." My son burst out laughing. That's when the bomb went off. My retirement party was about to become their worst nightmare. I just looked at my husband, Robert. He nodded. My next words left her frozen. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. But let me start from the beginning of that evening, because the pain I felt didn't begin with Sophia's cruel words. It started the moment I walked into the conference room that had been decorated for what everyone believed was my retirement celebration. The room buzzed with conversations that died the second I appeared in the doorway. 43 employees, people I'd worked alongside for decades, suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. The silence stretched uncomfortably until my assistant, Janet, broke it with forced enthusiasm. "Mrs. Henderson, you look lovely tonight." Her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're trying too hard to be normal. I smoothed down my navy blue dress, the nicest one I owned, and tried to ignore the way Sophia's friends from the marketing department were whispering behind their hands. I'd built Morrison Industries from nothing 38 years ago. I started in my garage after my first husband died, leaving me with a 2-year-old son and enough debt to drown in. Back then, people laughed at a young widow trying to manufacture industrial cleaning supplies. Now we employed over 300 people across 4 states. Robert, my husband of 15 years, squeezed my shoulder as we made our way to the front of the room. He'd joined the company 12 years ago when we merged with his smaller firm, and he'd been my anchor through every storm since. The way his jaw tightened told me he was as uncomfortable with this whole evening as I was. "Olivia," came Sophia's voice from across the room, sweet as poisoned honey. She glided toward us in a dress that probably cost more than most employees made in a month. At 34, she was everything I'd never been: polished, educated, and born into money. When Derek married her 6 years ago, I tried so hard to welcome her. I'd given her a position in the company, mentored her, and treated her like the daughter I'd never had. "Sophia," I forced a smile. "The decorations look beautiful." "Thank you. I wanted everything to be perfect for your big day," she said. Her eyes sparkled with something that wasn't quite warmth. After all, it's not every day someone finally accepts they're too old to run a company. The words hit like ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. "Don't let them win. Show me you've got my back. Hit that subscribe button right now, or you might miss the moment she gets what's coming to her." Around us, conversations resumed, but I caught the sidelong glances, the barely concealed smirks from Sophia's circle. She'd been working on this narrative for months, painting me as a doddering old woman clinging to power I no longer deserved. Derek appeared at Sophia's side, my son, who'd grown into a man I barely recognized. Where once he'd been thoughtful and kind, now he seemed hollow, always agreeing with whatever Sophia said. He kissed my cheek with the mechanical affection of obligation. "Mom, you must be so relieved," he said, his voice carrying Sophia's coaching. "No more stress, no more long hours. You can finally relax and let younger people handle the business." Younger people. As if wisdom came with a birth certificate date instead of decades of experience. I'd guided this company through 3 recessions, adapted to changing markets, and built relationships that had sustained us through impossible challenges. But apparently, at 68, I was suddenly obsolete. The presentations began with Janet reading a carefully prepared speech about my distinguished career and well-earned retirement. Each word felt like dirt being thrown on a grave I wasn't ready to occupy. Department heads shared sanitized memories, their words polite but distant, as if they were already mentally adjusting to new leadership. Through it all, Sophia stood near the front, accepting congratulations from people who assumed she'd be stepping into my role. She'd positioned herself perfectly over the past 2 years, volunteering for high-profile projects, making herself indispensable to daily operations. What they didn't know was that every move had been calculated, every smile hiding her true intentions. When the formal presentations ended, Sophia stepped forward, raising her champagne glass with theatrical flair. The room fell silent, everyone sensing this was the moment they'd been waiting for. "I think it's time for a real toast," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. To all the hard-working people who've made Morrison Industries the success it is today, to the employees who arrive early and stay late, who pour their hearts into their work, who actually care about this company's future. A few people raised their glasses hesitantly, unsure where this was heading. Sophia's smile turned sharp, predatory. To everyone who makes this company run, except the hag who owns it and steals the profit. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Someone dropped a glass. Janet gasped audibly. But what cut deepest wasn't Sophia's cruelty. It was the sound that followed. Derek's laughter. My son, the boy I'd raised alone, who I'd sacrificed everything for, threw back his head and laughed as if his wife had told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Other voices joined in, nervous at first, then growing bolder as they realized they were safe in their pack mentality. I felt completely alone in that room. If you've ever been betrayed like this, I need you to prove you're with me. Smash that like button and subscribe, so I know I'm not fighting this fight alone. I stood frozen, feeling every eye in the room on me. Some faces showed embarrassment, others barely concealed glee. These people had eaten at my table, had come to me with their problems, had built their careers on the foundation I'd created, and now they were laughing at my humiliation. The silence after the laughter died was deafening. Sophia stood there triumphant, clearly expecting me to crumble, to shuffle out in shame and leave her to claim her prize. Derek was still grinning, finally free to show his true feelings about the burden of having an aging mother who refused to step aside. That's when I turned to Robert. My husband's face was granite, but his eyes held the question we'd discussed so many times in the privacy of our home. Are you sure? This will change everything. I gave him the slightest nod. Robert straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Sophia, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Actually, Olivia isn't retiring. The room went dead quiet. Sophia's triumphant expression flickered. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the pain crushing my chest. That's right, I'm not retiring. I let the words sink in before delivering the blow that would change everything. I'm selling the company. This is it, the moment that will change everything. Don't leave me hanging. Subscribe to see what happens next, or if you're too scared to commit, tell me why in the comments. I dare you. Sophia's face went white. Derek's mouth fell open. The champagne glass slipped from someone's nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor like all their assumptions about the future. The sale was finalized this morning, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Morrison Industries now belongs to Hartfield Corporation. They'll be conducting their own review of all personnel and operations. In that moment, watching Sophia's world collapse around her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not joy, exactly, but a profound sense of justice. She tried to destroy me with words, to humiliate me in front of people who'd once respected me. But words were just air, and respect had to be earned, not inherited. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but I was already turning toward the door, Robert's steady presence at my side. I'd spent 38 years building something beautiful, and I'd rather see it in the hands of strangers than watch it be corrupted by people who valued cruelty over character. Behind me, I could hear Sophia's voice rising in panic, demanding answers that would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I was done being anyone's victim. That night, lying in bed next to Robert, I couldn't sleep. The image of Derek's laughter kept playing in my mind like a broken record. When had I lost my son? When had the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them roses turned into a man who could laugh at my humiliation? I knew the answer, even though admitting it felt like swallowing glass. It started 6 years ago, the day Derek brought Sophia home for Sunday dinner. She'd been charming that first evening, asking all the right questions about the business, expressing admiration for what I'd built. Derek's told me so much about how you started Morrison Industries, she'd said, her smile warm and genuine. It must have been incredibly difficult raising him alone while building a company. I'd been touched by her interest, her apparent understanding of the sacrifices I'd made. When Derek announced their engagement 3 months later, I'd been genuinely happy. My son had found someone who seemed to appreciate not just him, but the family legacy we'd built together. The changes started small, so subtle I barely noticed them at first. Sophia would mention during family dinners that some companies were modernizing their leadership structures, or casually comment on articles she'd read about multi-generational workplace challenges. She never said anything directly about me being too old, but the seeds were planted. Then came the suggestions disguised as concern. Olivia, you've been working so hard lately. Maybe you should consider reducing your hours. Or, Derek and I were talking, and we think you deserve to enjoy your golden years instead of stressing about quarterly reports. Golden years, as if living meant nothing more than waiting to die comfortably. The real turning point came 2 years ago during the Henderson account crisis. We'd been Morrison Industries' biggest client for 15 years, and their CEO had suddenly threatened to pull their contract over delivery delays caused by a supplier problem completely outside our control. I'd spent 3 days on the phone calling in favors, negotiating compromises, using relationships I'd built over decades to save that account. When I finally secured a new agreement that kept Henderson happy and our employees working, I'd been exhausted but triumphant. Sophia's response still burned in my memory. "Well, that was dramatic," she'd said during the company meeting where I announced we'd saved the contract. "A younger executive might have handled it more efficiently without all the emotional phone calls." The comment had been delivered with a smile, wrapped in just enough ambiguity that calling her out would have made me look defensive. But the damage was done. I saw the sideways glances from employees, the barely perceptible nods of agreement from people who suddenly wondered if my emotional approach was a sign of weakness rather than the passionate commitment that had built their paychecks. That's when I realized Sophia wasn't just making casual observations, she was systematically undermining my authority, painting me as an emotional, outdated obstacle to progress. Every suggestion about my age, every comment about modern business practices, every seemingly innocent remark about succession planning was another drop of poison in the well of respect I'd spent decades building. Derek, my trusting, loyal Derek, absorbed it all without question. He'd always been susceptible to strong personalities, content to let others lead while he followed. Sophia had recognized this weakness and exploited it masterfully. "Mom's been under a lot of stress lately," he started saying during family gatherings. "Maybe she should consider stepping back a bit." When I tried to discuss my concerns with him, Sophia was always there, nodding sympathetically while redirecting the conversation. Of course, Olivia feels defensive. Change is hard at any age, but especially when you've been in control for so long. The worst part was how she turned my own words against me. Every story I'd shared about the company's early struggles became evidence of my inability to let go. Every mention of lessons learned from past challenges became proof that I was stuck in outdated thinking. "Mom still talks about the recession of 2008 like it was yesterday," Derek would say, not realizing that my experience with that crisis was exactly what had helped us survive the pandemic shutdowns with minimal layoffs. Sophia says we need to focus on the future, not keep relitigating the past. Sophia says those 2 words became the beginning of every conversation, the justification for every decision, the new gospel according to my daughter-in-law, who'd never built anything from nothing, never had to make payroll when the accounts receivables were late, never had to look employees in the eye and promise their jobs were safe when everything was falling apart. The meetings became the most obvious battleground. Sophia would arrive with printed agendas and PowerPoint presentations, armed with business school terminology and consulting firm jargon. She'd present ideas that sounded innovative but ignored practical realities, proposed changes that would disrupt relationships I'd spent years cultivating. When I raised concerns based on experience, she'd nod thoughtfully and then say something like, "I appreciate Olivia's historical perspective, but we need to consider whether traditional approaches are still relevant in today's market." Historical perspective, traditional approaches, every word chosen to make me sound like a relic, a museum piece whose time had passed. The employees started looking to her instead of me during discussions. She'd positioned herself as the voice of progress while painting me as the voice of resistance. People who'd once sought my advice began going to Sophia first, treating her input as more valuable than mine. "She just has such fresh ideas," I'd overheard Janet saying to another employee. "Sometimes experience can be limiting, you know. Sophia sees possibilities that someone who's been doing things the same way for decades might miss." Janet, who'd been with me for 12 years. Janet, whose job I'd saved during the restructuring 5 years ago when the board suggested we could automate her position. Janet, who now spoke about me like I was a well-meaning but outdated impediment to progress. The final insult came 6 months ago when Sophia suggested I might benefit from executive coaching to help me adapt to changing leadership styles. She'd presented it during a family dinner, framing it as a generous gift and investment in my personal development. There are some wonderful programs for senior executives transitioning to advisory roles, she'd explained, her tone gentle and caring. Olivia, you've given so much to this company. Maybe it's time to let others contribute their energy while you provide wisdom and guidance. Senior executives transitioning to advisory roles. The euphemism was so perfectly crafted, so diplomatically venomous, that I almost admired the skill behind it. Derek had nodded enthusiastically. That sounds perfect, Mum. You'd still be involved, but without all the daily stress. Sophia's right. You've earned the right to relax. Earned the right to relax. As if my life's work was a burden I'd finally paid off, rather than a calling that gave my days meaning. That night, Robert had found me crying in my office at home, surrounded by photo albums filled with company milestones, employee celebrations, moments of triumph that suddenly felt hollow. She's stealing it all, I'd whispered to him, not just the company, but the respect, the relationships, everything I built. And Derek can't see it, or won't see it. Robert had held me while I sobbed, his own anger carefully controlled. What do you want to do? He'd asked quietly. That's when the idea first took shape. If Sophia wanted to paint me as obsolete, as a burden holding back progress, then maybe it was time to show her what burden really looked like. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for something I could simply take away. The next morning, I'd called my lawyer and my financial advisor. By that afternoon, I had 3 potential buyers interested in Morrison Industries, each willing to pay above market value for a profitable, well-established company with a strong client base. The irony was perfect. Sophia had spent 2 years convincing everyone that the company would be better off without me. Now she was about to find out if she was right. Rolling over to face Robert, I finally spoke into the darkness. Do you think I'm doing the right thing? He was quiet for a long moment. Then his hand found mine. I think you're doing the only thing that lets you keep your dignity. And sometimes that's all we have left. Tomorrow, Sophia would learn that stealing someone's legacy isn't as simple as poisoning their reputation. Tomorrow, she'd discover that the old woman she'd been so eager to dismiss still had some lessons to teach. The morning after the party, my phone started ringing at 6:30. The first call was from Janet, her voice tight with panic. Mrs. Henderson, I don't understand. The employees are asking questions and I don't know what to tell them. Is it true? Did you really sell Morrison Industries? I sat at my kitchen table watching Robert make coffee with the methodical precision he brought to everything. His presence anchored me, reminded me that I wasn't facing this alone. Yes, Janet, the sale is final. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. But what about our jobs? What about everything we've built here? For the first time since last night, I felt a stab of genuine regret. Janet wasn't part of Sophia's poison campaign. She was just a hard-working woman trying to support her family, caught in the crossfire of a war she hadn't chosen. Hartfield Corporation is committed to maintaining operations, I said, trying to inject reassurance into my voice. They're primarily interested in Morrison Industries because we're profitable and well-run. Good employees have nothing to fear. After I hung up, Robert placed a cup of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. How many more calls like that do you think you'll get today? Probably dozens, I replied. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. The ones who matter will understand eventually. The others, I shrugged, surprised by how little I cared about the others anymore. The next call came from George, our operations manager. Unlike Janet, George had been one of Sophia's early converts, always ready to agree when she suggested my methods were outdated. Olivia, what the hell is going on? You can't just sell the company without consulting the management team. We have a right to know what's happening to our futures. His tone grated against my nerves like sandpaper. Our futures. As if he'd built anything, risked anything, sacrificed anything to create those futures in the first place. George, you'll need to direct all questions about personnel decisions to Hartfield Corporation. They'll be contacting department heads within the week to discuss transition plans. This is insane, he sputtered. Sophia said you'd been acting erratically, but I never thought you'd do something this destructive. Don't you care about what happens to the people who work for you? I almost laughed at the accusation. Sophia said. Even now, even in his outrage, he couldn't form an opinion without referencing her guidance. I care enough to make sure the company survives with its reputation intact, I replied evenly. Something that was becoming increasingly unlikely under current circumstances. After I ended that call, Robert reached across the table and took my hand. Any regrets yet? I considered the question seriously. No, I said, and I meant it. If anything, these calls are reminding me why this was necessary. The third call was the one I'd been dreading most. Derek's voice crackled through the speaker, raw with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Hurt, anger, betrayal. Mom, I need to understand what's happening. Sophia is beside herself. She keeps saying, you've destroyed everything we worked for, everything we worked for. The pronouns stung more than I'd expected. When had my life's work become a collective effort that somehow excluded me? Derek, can you come over? This conversation needs to happen in person. I can't leave Sophia right now. She's not taking this well. Of course he couldn't leave Sophia. My son, who'd once run to me with every skinned knee and broken heart, now couldn't spare an hour to sit with his mother while his wife processed the consequences of her own cruelty. Then bring her, I said, though the words tasted bitter. We all need to have this conversation. They arrived an hour later, and I could see the change in both of them. Immediately, Sophia's usual polished composure had cracked, revealing something desperate and angry underneath. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse, and her perfectly styled hair showed signs of anxious, running fingers through it. Derek looked exhausted, his eyes reddened with the telltale signs of a sleepless night spent managing his wife's emotional crisis. He barely met my gaze as they settled onto the living room couch, sitting close enough that Sophia could grip his arm for support. Mom, he started, his voice carefully controlled. Help me understand why you would sell the company without discussing it with family first. I thought we were partners in this business. Partners? The word was Sophia's. I was certain of it. Derek had never spoken about our relationship in business terms before she entered our lives. Partners discuss major decisions together, Sophia added, her voice sharp despite its tremor. Partners don't make unilateral choices that affect everyone's future. I looked at her steadily. This woman who'd spent 2 years systematically undermining my authority, questioning my decisions, and positioning herself as my inevitable replacement. You're absolutely right, Sophia. Partners do discuss major decisions together. I paused, letting the words settle. Which is why I found it interesting that you and Derek had apparently been discussing succession planning without including me in those conversations. The colour drained from Sophia's face. Derek shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the pattern on Robert's area rug. We were thinking about the future, Derek mumbled. About what would happen eventually. Eventually, I repeated. And when exactly did eventually become immediately? When did planning for the distant future become active campaigning for my removal? Sophia found her voice, though it came out higher than usual. Olivia, I never campaigned for anything. If I expressed concerns about the company's direction, it was because I care about its success. Concerns about the company's direction? I echoed. Is that what you call suggesting I was too emotional to handle client crisis? Or recommending executive coaching to help me adapt to changing leadership styles? Or perhaps you mean last night when you publicly called me a hag who steals profit from the company I built? The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's grip on Derek's arm tightened until her knuckles went white. Derek stared at me with something that might have been recognition, as if he was finally hearing his wife's words through someone else's ears. I was upset last night, Sophia said weakly. I said things I didn't mean. No, I replied quietly. You said exactly what you meant. You said what you've been thinking for 2 years, what you've been carefully suggesting to anyone who would listen. The only difference was that last night you said it out loud. Robert cleared his throat softly. Olivia, should you tell them about Hartfield's decision regarding personnel? I'd been dreading this moment, but it was time. The documentation I'd provided to Hartfield Corporation about Sophia's behaviour hadn't been shared out of spite, but out of necessity. A responsible company needed to understand the dynamics they'd be inheriting. Hartfield Corporation has completed their initial personnel review, I said, watching Sophia's face carefully. They'll be retaining most of the current staff with some exceptions. Exceptions? Derek's voice cracked slightly. Department restructuring is common in acquisitions, I continued. Hartfield has their own marketing team and won't be needing additional staff in that area. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. She actually rocked backward on the couch, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. But I've been essential to the marketing operations, she stammered. I've increased our client base by 30% over the past 2 years. Using relationships and contracts I'd established over decades, I corrected gently. Hartfield was quite interested in understanding how those relationships had been managed recently. The full implications were starting to dawn on her. Sophia's eyes darted between Derek and me, looking for some sign that this was negotiable, that there was still a way to salvage her position. What exactly did you tell them about me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told them the truth, I said simply. I provided documentation of workplace interactions, employee complaints that had been filed, and examples of communications that demonstrated management style and professional judgment. Derek looked confused. What employee complaints? You never mentioned any complaints. Because they were dismissed, Sophia said quickly, but her voice carried no conviction. They were minor workplace disagreements, nothing serious. Jessica filed a formal complaint about public humiliation during budget meetings, I said, my voice steady and factual. Marcus documented overtime demands for personal projects accompanied by age-related harassment. Isabella reported deliberate scheduling conflicts designed to make her look incompetent. With each name, Sophia seemed to shrink further into the couch. These weren't random accusations, they were documented patterns of behavior that painted a clear picture of someone who used her position to belittle and intimidate others. Derek, Sophia turned to her husband with desperate eyes. You have to do something. Call the buyer, explain that there's been a misunderstanding, tell them I'm essential to the company's success. But Derek was staring at me with a strange expression, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Mom, are you saying Sophia has been mistreating employees? The question hung in the air like smoke. The truth hurts, but it's the only thing that sets you free. If you're on the side of justice, then subscribe now. If you're not, go ahead and comment about why you're cool with injustice. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. This was when my son would have to choose between comfortable illusion and painful truth. I'm saying that Hartfield Corporation makes personnel decisions based on documented performance and professional conduct, I replied. What they decide about individual employees is their prerogative. Sophia shot to her feet, her composure finally shattering completely. This is revenge, pure and simple. You're punishing me because I had the courage to say what everyone was thinking. You can't stand that people see through your act anymore. The accusation might have hurt a day ago. Now it just felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. Sophia, I said, rising to face her, if you believe this is revenge, then you've learned nothing from the consequences of your own actions. She started toward the door, then spun back around. Come on, Derek. We don't have to stay here and listen to this. But Derek didn't move. He sat on the couch, staring at his hands, his entire world-view crumbling around him. Derek. Sophia's voice carried a note of panic now. Derek, we're leaving. My son looked up at his wife, then at me, then back at his wife. For the first time in years, I saw him thinking for himself instead of simply absorbing someone else's opinions. Sophia, he said quietly, I think I need to hear what Mom has to say. Sophia stood frozen in my living room doorway, her face a mask of disbelief as Derek's words sank in. For 2 years, she'd controlled every conversation, guided every decision, shaped every opinion. Now, for the first time, her husband was choosing to listen to someone else. Derek, you can't be serious, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. She's manipulating you, just like she's been manipulating this entire situation. Can't you see that? But Derek wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me with eyes that seemed suddenly older, wearier, as if he was waking up from a long dream. "Mom," he said quietly, "tell me about the employee complaints Sophia mentioned. Tell me everything." I glanced at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. This was the conversation I'd been avoiding for months, hoping that somehow Derek would see the truth on his own. But Sophia's influence had run too deep, her manipulation too skillful. Sometimes the only way to remove poison was to cut it out completely. "Let's start with Jessica," I said, settling back into my chair. "She's 58 years old, been with the company for 14 years, started in data entry, worked her way up to senior accountant through night school, and sheer determination. Last March, during the quarterly budget review, Sophia publicly criticized Jessica's reporting methods in front of the entire management team." Derek frowned. "What kind of criticism?" I pulled out a folder. I'd prepared weeks ago, knowing this conversation would eventually come. Inside were printed emails, incident reports, and witness statements I'd been quietly collecting. Sophia told the room that Jessica's antiquated spreadsheet methods were holding back the accounting department's efficiency. She suggested that someone with more current technical skills should take over the quarterly reports. "That doesn't sound unreasonable," Sophia interjected, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "If there were efficiency issues." "Jessica's methods weren't inefficient," I continued, looking directly at Derek. "They were thorough. Her reports caught discrepancies that automated systems missed, but Sophia wasn't interested in accuracy. She was interested in making Jessica look incompetent in front of her peers." I handed Derek a printed email from Jessica's file. "This is the formal complaint Jessica filed 3 days after that meeting. She wrote that she felt humiliated and questioned whether her age was the real issue Sophia had with her work." Derek read the email, his frown deepening. "What happened to this complaint?" "It was dismissed," Robert said quietly. Sophia's supervisor believed her explanation that she was simply trying to modernize departmental procedures because Sophia is very good at making her cruelty sound like business necessity, I added. "She has a talent for wrapping personal attacks in professional language." Sophia moved away from the doorway, her hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous. I was trying to improve efficiency, not attack anyone personally. If Jessica felt criticized, maybe she should have looked at her own performance instead of running to file complaints." The callousness in her voice made Derek's head snap up. He stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, and I recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look he'd worn as a child when he discovered that a friend had been lying to him. "There's more," I said gently. "Marcus, our IT support manager, 62 years old, been maintaining our computer systems for 8 years without a single major failure." I pulled out another set of documents. Sophia began requesting that Marcus work overtime on what she called urgent system updates. These weren't company projects, they were personal tasks, setting up her home office computer, troubleshooting her laptop, even helping her design PowerPoint presentations for outside consulting work she was doing. Derek's face went pale. She was using company employees for personal projects. When Marcus tried to explain that these tasks weren't part of his job description, Sophia told him that in the modern workplace, employees need to be flexible and adaptive. She implied that someone his age might not understand how to be a team player. Sophia's laugh was sharp and defensive. Marcus was being difficult. I offered to pay him overtime for the extra work. "Overtime that came out of the company budget," Robert pointed out, "not your personal account." I handed Derek another folder. Marcus's complaint detailed 6 months of after-hours demands along with comments about his slower processing speed and suggestions that younger employees would be more responsive to urgent requests. "And this complaint was also dismissed?" Derek asked, though he already seemed to know the answer. Sophia's supervisor felt she was simply showing initiative by keeping older employees engaged with challenging projects, I said. The age-related comments were characterized as motivational rather than discriminatory. Sophia began pacing, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with increasing agitation. "I can't believe you're twisting every interaction into some kind of conspiracy. These were legitimate workplace issues." What about Isabella? I asked, opening a third folder. 55 years old, cleaning supervisor, been keeping our offices immaculate for 6 years. Derek looked confused. What could Sophia possibly have had against a cleaning supervisor? Isabella works the evening shift cleaning offices after business hours. Last year, Sophia began scheduling late meetings that required certain conference rooms to be cleaned again the next morning. When Isabella explained that the cleaning schedule was designed around normal business hours, Sophia complained to HR that Isabella was inflexible and didn't understand customer service. I pulled out a series of emails. Sophia wrote that Isabella seemed confused by simple instructions and suggested that language barriers might be affecting her ability to understand requests. Language barriers? Derek's voice was tight. Isabella was born in New Mexico, Robert said dryly. Her English is perfect. She's actually bilingual, which has been helpful when we've had Spanish-speaking clients visit the offices. Sophia stopped pacing. I never said anything about language barriers specifically, if there were communication issues. You wrote, and I quote, "Perhaps we need cleaning staff who can better understand and respond to American business expectations." Isabella filed a complaint alleging ethnic discrimination. The silence that followed was suffocating. Derek stared at the email in his hands, reading Sophia's words over and over, as if hoping they would somehow say something different. There are 8 more complaints in these files, I said quietly, all from employees over 50, all dismissed because Sophia's explanations always sounded reasonable to supervisors. What pattern? Derek whispered. Your wife systematically targeted older employees, using their age, experience, and background as weapons against them. She made them feel worthless, outdated, and unwelcome in their own workplace. Sophia finally exploded. That's not true. I was trying to bring fresh thinking to a stagnant company. Sometimes that means making difficult personnel decisions. Sometimes that means having honest conversations about performance. Honest conversations, I repeated. Is that what you call telling the Henderson account team that I was too emotional to handle client crisis, or suggesting to the board that I needed executive coaching because I was resistant to change? Derek looked up sharply. You told the board that Mom needed coaching? Sophia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The company was going through challenges. I thought professional development might help. You thought it might help push me aside, I said calmly. Just like you pushed aside Jessica, Marcus, Isabella, and everyone else who stood in the way of your vision of what the company should become. And what was that vision? Derek asked, his voice barely audible. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful, and saw that he was finally ready to hear the truth. A company run by younger, more modern thinkers, I said. A company where experience was seen as a liability rather than an asset. A company where Sophia could position herself as the inevitable successor to an outdated founder who didn't. The truth about the past, the present, and the future has been revealed. If you think justice has been served and you're with me, subscribe now and don't miss out on more stories like this. But if you think I'm a monster or that Sophia was right, tell me why in the comments.